Flight Lieutenant Tom Eales eased the Buccaneer S.2B down to 100 feet above the Nevada scrub, the radar altimeter flickering as creosote bushes blurred beneath the wing. Behind him, navigator Mike Bush watched the moving map and the threat receiver. The aircraft was a 1962 design built for delivering a single nuclear weapon onto Soviet warships in the Norwegian Sea, and on this October morning in 1977, it was hunting simulated armored columns at Nellis Air Force Base on the opening week of Red Flag 78-1. The Americans had invited the Royal Air Force to send 8 aircraft. Strike Command at High Wycombe had dispatched 12, drawn from 208 Squadron at RAF Honington and 216 Squadron at RAF Larbruck in West Germany, with crews who had spent 3 years learning to fly lower than anyone else in NATO. The decision to accept the invitation had been taken inside the MOD's main building in Whitehall the previous spring. Air Marshal Sir Neil Cameron, soon to become Chief of the Air Staff, had pushed it through against Treasury resistance. The Buccaneer Force was the RAF's only dedicated maritime strike asset west of Cyprus, and Cameron wanted the Americans to see what it could do before the Tornado GR-1 entered service at the end of the decade, and the Buccaneer was reassigned to anti-shipping duties in the North Atlantic. The Jaguar GR-1 squadrons at RAF Coltishall were already committed to the Central Front. The Buccaneer, the JIC's assessment had quietly noted, remained the aircraft the Soviets feared most in the maritime role because they could not detect it. At Nellis, the F-15A Eagles of the 555th Tactical Fighter Squadron were flying as Red Air, supplementing F-5Es from the resident aggressor squadrons. The Eagle had entered service the previous year and was the most capable air superiority fighter in the world, with a Hughes APG-63 pulse Doppler radar designed to look down and detect low-flying targets against ground clutter at ranges beyond 50 miles. The American pilots had been briefed that the British aircraft would be flying low. They had not been briefed how low. Eales crossed the initial point at 540 knots, 80 feet above the desert floor, throttles set just below the smoke threshold of the twin Rolls-Royce Spey engines. The Buccaneer's airframe, designed for carrier operations from HMS Eagle and HMS Ark Royal, had a wing loading higher than any other strike aircraft in NATO. It punched through low-level turbulence without bucking. Behind him in the second aircraft, squadron leader Graham Pitchfork was navigating by stopwatch and map, the inertial system having drifted out of useful tolerance 15 minutes earlier. Both crews were using the boundary layer control system to keep approach speeds down and the rotating bomb bay to carry practice weapons internally, eliminating the radar return of external pylons. On the red flag scoring radar at Tonopah, the Buccaneers vanished. Controllers initially assumed a software fault. The F-15s vectored onto the predicted attack axis from a Boeing E-3 Sentry orbit at 29,000 feet, saw nothing on their scopes until the British aircraft were already past the target area and climbing for the egress turn. The first pass produced 6 simulated kills against the defending armour at range 62 and 0 engagements by the defending fighters. The American debriefers at the Red Flag Operations Building that evening asked the same question 3 times in different forms. The British crews gave the same answer. The Americans wrote it down and did not believe it. The answer was 100 feet. Not 500, which was the standard NATO low-level training height in West Germany. Not 250, which the United States Air Force used for its own low-level routes through the Nevada ranges. 100 feet above the highest obstacle, by day in formation, navigating by map and stopwatch, with the radio silent and the radar switched off. The technique had been refined at RAF Honington and at the Tactical Weapons Unit at RAF Brodie in West Wales since 1969, when the Buccaneer S.2 had been transferred from the Fleet Air Arm to the RAF after the cancellation of the CVA-01 carrier program by Dennis Healy's Defence Review of 1966. The aircraft had been designed by Blackburn at Brough on the Humber for a specific mission, penetrate Soviet naval air defenses in the Norwegian Sea, deliver a Redbeard or later a WE-177 nuclear depth bomb against a Sverdlov-class cruiser or a Kiev-class carrier, and recover to a small carrier deck in foul North Atlantic weather. Everything about the airframe served that mission. The fuselage was area-ruled for transonic acceleration at sea level. The wing was small and stiff. The boundary layer control system blew compressor air over the flaps and tailplane to allow carrier approach speeds despite the high wing loading. The bomb bay rotated to keep stores out of the airflow. When the aircraft moved to the RAF, the strike role shifted from sea to land. The Cabinet Office had decided in 1968 that the Buccaneer would replace the Canberra in the conventional strike role in West Germany and the maritime strike role from UK bases. The air staff at the MOD had a problem. Soviet integrated air defences along the inner German border, in particular the SA-6 gainful system that had appeared during the 1973 Yom Kippur War and devastated the Israeli Air Force, had a minimum engagement altitude that was difficult to establish but believed by the Defense Intelligence Staff to be around 200 feet. The Tornado was still years away. The Jaguar could fly low but lacked range. The Buccaneer had range, payload, and an airframe stable enough at very low level to fly below the SA-6's minimum. The decision was taken to train the force to operate at heights that would put the aircraft below the radar horizon of any known Warsaw Pact ground-based system. The MOD did not publicize the figure. Squadron commanders at Honington and Larbrook worked it out through trial and accident. 2 aircraft and 4 aircrew were lost to controlled flight into terrain between 1972 and 1976. The survivors developed a technique of flying in loose pairs, leader navigating, wingman maintaining a position about a mile back, and slightly higher to clear the leader's wake. The radar altimeter was used as a warning rather than a reference. The eye was the instrument. By 1977, the Buccaneer force at Honington and Larbrook could put 8 aircraft across a Warsaw Pact frontier at 100 feet in radio silence, on time to within 15 seconds, with crews who had flown the route a dozen times in simulation and could continue to the target if the inertial system failed, the radar failed, and the radio failed. The Americans at Nellis had no equivalent capability and no equivalent training. They were about to be told in a series of debriefs that became increasingly tense why their F-15s had been unable to find a 13-year-old British attack aircraft over open desert. The political context at Whitehall was sharper than the Nevada light. James Callaghan's Labour government, elected in October 1974 and surviving on the Lib-Lab Pact since March 1977, was approaching its second sterling crisis in 2 years. The Treasury was demanding further reductions in the defence budget under the terms of the IMF loan of December 1976. Roy Mason had handed over the MOD to Fred Mulley in September 1976 when Mason moved to Northern Ireland. Mulley was a quiet figure, an academic economist by training, whose tenure at the MOD would be remembered chiefly for the photograph of him appearing to doze during a Queen's birthday flypast at RAF Finningley in September 1977, weeks before Red Flag began. The Chiefs of Staff meeting at the MOD on Tuesday afternoons were preoccupied with a different problem. The Soviet Northern Fleet at Severomorsk had grown by 40% in submarine numbers since 1970, and the new Kiev-class carrier Minsk was expected to enter service before the end of the decade. The Cabinet's Defence and Oversea Policy Committee, which Callaghan chaired personally, had agreed in May 1977 to maintain the maritime strike commitment to SACLANT despite Treasury pressure. The Buccaneer force was the visible expression of that commitment. Air Marshal Cameron, who took over as CAS on August 1, 1977, needed Red Flag to demonstrate that the commitment was credible. The American side of the conversation was less straightforward. The United States Air Force had inaugurated Red Flag in November 1975 at the direction of General Robert J. Dixon at Tactical Air Command Headquarters at Langley, Virginia. The premise was that air combat losses in Vietnam had concentrated heavily on air crews flying their first 10 combat missions. If pilots could be exposed to realistic combat conditions in training before they reached a real war, the curve could be flattened. Red Flag's brief was to provide that training, with aggressor squadrons flying Soviet tactics, electronic warfare emitters reproducing Warsaw Pact threats, and a scoring system that recorded every engagement. The invitation to the RAF was extended through the British Defence Staff at the embassy in Washington in a routine letter from Tactical Air Command in February 1977. The text suggested that an RAF participation would help validate Red Flag for NATO planning purposes and provide useful interoperability experience. Strike Command's reply was sent through the Air Attaché at Washington, Air Vice Marshal John Stacey, in March. The Americans expected the British to send Jaguars or perhaps the Vulcan B.2, which was still in the strike role with the Waddington wing. The reply offered Buccaneers. There was a pause in Washington. Tactical Air Command had not flown against Buccaneers, and the type was not on the standard NATO threat or friendly aircraft recognition cards in the form used at Nellis. A second exchange of letters clarified the aircraft's performance envelope. The Americans assumed the British figures were optimistic. Strike Command did not correct the assumption. By July 1977, the deployment was confirmed. 12 aircraft with VC-10 tanker support from RAF Bryce Norton to operate from Nellis between October 1st and November 11th, 1977. The crews selected included squadron leader Bill Cope as detachment commander and a mix of first tour and second tour navigators. The order was simple. Fly the way you train at Honington. Do not modify the techniques. Let the Americans see them. The deployment routed through Goose Bay in Labrador, where the Buccaneers staged from the joint Canadian-American base on September 30th, 1977, for the long leg to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, and onward to Nellis. The VC-10K.2s from 101 Squadron had not yet entered service, and the tanker support came from Victor K.2s of 55 and 57 squadrons at RAF Marham, operating in the air-to-air refueling configuration that had been worked up in haste during the Indonesian confrontation a decade earlier. The transit was uneventful except for the loss of one Victor's hose drum unit, which forced 2 Buccaneers to divert into Bangor, Maine on the morning of October 1st. The aircraft that arrived at Nellis on the afternoon of October 2nd were finished in the matte dark sea grey and dark green wraparound camouflage that had replaced the original glossy white anti-flash scheme during the early 1970s, when the strategic nuclear role had passed to the Royal Navy's Polaris submarines and the V-bomber force had switched to low-level penetration. Each aircraft carried the squadron's tactical markings on the fin: a winged sword for 208, a Pegasus for 216. The detachment was housed in temporary accommodation on the west side of the Nellis ramp, separate from the resident American units. The first week was given over to area familiarization. The Nevada ranges covered an area larger than Wales, with terrain varying from flat desert to ridges rising to 9,000 feet around Tonopah and the Belted Range. The British crews flew the routes initially at 500 feet, in accordance with Red Flag standing orders, with American safety pilots in the back seat of 2 aircraft converted to dual control. By Thursday of the first week, Squadron Leader Cope had requested and received permission to operate at the British training height for the active exercise phase. The Red Flag Director, Brigadier General Charles A. Gabriel, signed the waiver personally. The first scored mission flew on the morning of Monday, October 10th, 1977. 4 Buccaneers from 208 Squadron, led by Cope, transited to the initial point at 250 feet and dropped to 100 feet for the target run. The target was a simulated railway marshalling yard at range 62, defended by Hawk and Vulcan surface-to-air missile simulators, and patrolled by 2 F-15As from the 555th and 2 F-5Es from the 64th Aggressor Squadron. The Buccaneers were detected on inbound radar at a range of approximately 12 miles, against a planned detection range of 40 miles. They were detected too late for the F-15s to convert the radar contact into a visual identification before the bomb release. All 4 aircraft delivered simulated 1,000-pound retarded bombs on the target and egressed at 150 feet, still below the F-15's minimum useful look-down altitude in that part of the range. The scoring radar recorded 4 target hits, 4 egress survivals, and 0 air-to-air kills against the British. In the debrief at the Red Flag building that afternoon, the American flight lead, a major from the 555th, asked Cope what altitude the run had been flown at. Cope said 100 feet. The major asked whether that was indicated altitude or radar altimeter altitude. Cope said radar altimeter, above the highest obstacle on the run-in. The major asked whether it had been a single pass or a planned weave. Cope said straight and level. The major did not write the answer down. By the second week, the pattern was established. The Buccaneers flew 9 more scored missions between October 11th and 24th. The F-15s adjusted tactics, dropping CAP altitudes from 15,000 feet to 5,000 feet and flying narrower patterns over the predicted target areas. The detection ranges improved slightly. The kill ratios did not. The British aircraft were detected on average at between 8 and 15 miles from the target and were rarely intercepted before weapons release. On the egress, with bomb bays closed and speed at 580 knots indicated, they routinely outran the F-5Es and disappeared into terrain that the F-15s, constrained by their own safety floor of 500 feet, could not follow them into. The aggressor pilots at Nellis were the best in the United States Air Force at simulating Soviet tactics. They had been studying MiG-21 and MiG-23 doctrines since the squadron's formation in 1972, and had fought against every NATO and Allied air force that had passed through Red Flag. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Roger Wells, asked the British detachment leader for a separate briefing. Cope and his senior navigator, squadron leader David Heriot, walked Wells through the technique. Pair tactics, navigation by stopwatch, terrain masking using ridges and dry watercourses, attack profile flat at 100 feet with a brief pop-up to acquire the target visually at the last possible moment, weapon release in level flight or shallow dive, egress at the same height as the run-in. Wells listened. He asked how often this had been practiced. Cope said 2 or 3 times a week per crew, every week for the last 6 years. The American problem was structural. The F-15A's Hughes APG-63 radar was an excellent pulse Doppler set, designed by engineers at Hughes Aircraft in Culver City to defeat Soviet bomber threats. Against a target at 100 feet over rolling terrain, the Doppler return from the target competed with the ground return at every range gate. The filtering algorithms in the signal processor, which removed the dominant zero Doppler ground return, also removed slow-closing targets whose closing rate fell within the notch. A Buccaneer crossing the F-15's radar beam at 90 degrees with no closure component produced a return that the processor discarded as ground clutter. The British crews had not been told this in detail, although they understood the principle. They flew crossing tracks whenever the geometry allowed. There was a secondary advantage which the Americans took longer to identify. The Buccaneers' radar cross-section, with the bomb bay closed and no external pylons, was substantially smaller than the F-15s had expected. The aircraft had been built when low observability was not a design goal, but its shape, with a small wing, a fared-in canopy and stores carried internally, gave it a frontal cross-section in the rough range of 3 to 5 square meters against a B-52's 100. No formal British figure was ever shared. The Defense Intelligence Staff had calculated 1. It remained classified for the rest of the Cold War. The aggressor squadron at Nellis, after the second debrief with Cope, asked whether they could borrow a Buccaneer aircrew for a week to fly as Red Air against the next Red Flag rotation. The request went up the chain. Strike Command refused. The detachment had been authorized for the exercise period only, and Mully's office in Whitehall did not want photographs of British aircraft simulating Soviet attacks on American targets appearing in the Las Vegas papers during a sterling crisis. The exercise concluded on November 11, 1977. The Buccaneers had flown approximately 250 sorties between them, with no losses, no major incidents, and no aircraft unserviceable on the morning of the redeployment. The American scoring system showed the British detachment with one of the highest target attack success rates of any unit to have flown red flag to that point. The aggregate air-to-air loss rate against the F-15s and F-5Es was below 10%, against an exercise average for incoming NATO units that ran above 40. Brigadier General Gabriel hosted a closing dinner at the Nellis Officers Club on the evening of November 10th. He made a short speech in which he said the United States Air Force had learned more from the British detachment than the British detachment had learned from Red Flag. The remark was reported in slightly different forms by several of the British crews present, and was repeated in the after-action narrative prepared at Strike Command Headquarters at High Wycombe for the CAS and circulated within the MOD in December. It was not made public. Gabriel went on to become Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force in 1982. He retained an interest in the Buccaneer and in low-level penetration tactics for the rest of his career. The detachment recovered to RAF Honington and RAF Larbruch via Goose Bay on November 13th and 14th. The aircraft were refurbished and returned to squadron service. The crews wrote their reports. The reports went to Strike Command, to the MOD, and, in summary form, to the Defence Intelligence Staff. A version was shared with the JIC, which was at that point chaired by Sir Anthony Duff, and a further summary was prepared for the Cabinet's Defence and Overseas Policy Committee under Callaghan. The political effect in Whitehall was modest but real. Cameron, as CAS, used the red flag results in his briefings to the Defence Committee during the Tornado in-service planning discussions of 1978. The argument was straightforward. The Buccaneer was demonstrably effective against the most modern Western fighter in conditions designed by the United States to be as realistic as possible short of war. The capability gap that the Tornado was being acquired to close was, in respect of low-level penetration, narrower than the air staff had previously argued. The Tornado program proceeded on schedule, but the case for accelerating the retirement of the Buccaneer, which had been pressed by Treasury officials throughout 1976 and early 1977, was quietly dropped. The Buccaneer remained in frontline service with the RAF for another 17 years, retiring only in March 1994 after deployment to the Gulf War. The American response was different in kind. Tactical Air Command commissioned a review of low-level penetration tactics across the United States Air Force in early 1978, drawing on the red flag data. The 555th and the aggressor squadrons modified their training to include very low-level adversary profiles. The F-15 fleet eventually received a radar software upgrade, MSIP, which improved the look-down performance against slow-closing crossing targets, although the full upgrade did not enter service until the mid-1980s. The Eagle community at Nellis continued to discuss the 1977 deployment for years afterwards. The phrase that recurred in their accounts was that the British had simply flown lower than the Americans had thought was possible or sensible in a peacetime exercise. The longer reverberation reached Moscow by a less direct route. The Soviet Air Defense Forces, the PVO Strany, had been tracking RAF Buccaneer deployments through the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap since the early 1970s, when the type's transfer from the Royal Navy had become known through open sources and through human intelligence reporting from London. The PVO's assessment, prepared at its Kalinin headquarters and shared with the Soviet General Staff, had identified the Buccaneer as a significant maritime strike threat to the Northern Fleet, but had not until 1978 fully understood the height regime in which the type operated. Some of that understanding came from intercepted American discussion of the red flag results. The Soviet Signals Intelligence Service, the 8th Chief Directorate of the KGB, monitored United States Air Force tactical communications routinely. The intercepts in late 1977 and early 1978 made clear that the F-15 community had been embarrassed by a British aircraft flying lower than its radar could see. The PVO response was a program of upgrades to the low-altitude capability of the Northern Fleet's air defenses. The SA-N-4 Gecko, already in service on Soviet warships, was supplemented from the early 1980s by the SA-N-9 Gauntlet, which had a minimum engagement altitude below 50 feet. The Tu-126 Moss airborne early warning aircraft, which had been operational since the early 1970s and was the rough Soviet equivalent of the E-3 Sentry, was supplemented and eventually replaced by the A-50 Mainstay from 1984 onwards. The Mainstay had a substantially improved low-altitude detection capability over land and water, designed in part to address the threat of NATO low-level strike aircraft, of which the Buccaneer was the leading example. The Soviet Maritime Strategy Review of 1981, conducted under Admiral Gorshkov, included a specific assessment of the Buccaneer threat against the Kirov-class battlecruiser, then entering service, and the new Slava-class missile cruisers. In Britain, the operational lesson was absorbed into the curriculum at the Tactical Weapons Unit at Brawdy and at the Buccaneer Operational Conversion Unit, 237 OCU, at RAF Honington. The 100-foot training profile became the standard for the maritime strike role and continued through the Buccaneers' reassignment to anti-shipping duties in the early 1980s. The aircraft was equipped with the Sea Eagle anti-ship missile from 1985, replacing the elderly Martel, and the combination of low-level penetration and standoff attack made the Buccaneer a serious problem for any surface ship's defences for the remainder of its service life. The crews who had flown at Nellis dispersed through the RAF over the following decade. Eales went on to command 12 Squadron at Lossiemouth and later served as Commandant of the Central Flying School. Pitchfork retired as an Air Commodore and wrote the most thorough operational history of the Buccaneer Force. Cope retired as a Group Captain. Heriot, who had walked Wells through the technique, became a senior navigator instructor at 237 OCU and one of the principal authors of the post-Red Flag Tactical Doctrine document. The Buccaneer itself flew its last operational sorties from Muharraq in Bahrain in February 1991, designating targets for Tornado GR-1s during Operation Granby, the British contribution to the liberation of Kuwait. The aircraft were unpainted in the original anti-flash white that had not been worn since 1971, hastily applied at Lossiemouth to meet the desert environment. The crews flew at low level in formation in radio silence against an integrated air defense system that the United States Air Force had spent the previous month dismantling with stealth bombers and cruise missiles. The Buccaneer worked, the technique worked. The training, refined over 20 years from Honington to Nellis to the Gulf, worked. The Red Flag deployment of 1977 has been written about more often by Americans than by Britons. The official RAF account remained classified until the 1990s and was never published in full. The American accounts, by veterans of the 555th and the aggressor squadrons, appeared in flying magazines and unit histories through the 1980s and 1990s and tended to emphasize the technical lessons, the limitations of the APG-63 against low crossing targets, the value of dedicated adversary training, the need for adversary aircraft to fly at heights that approximated likely Soviet attack profiles. The Buccaneers' role in revealing these lessons was acknowledged but not dwelt upon, perhaps because the lesson had been administered by an Allied force flying an obsolete aircraft. The British accounts, when they emerged, came principally from the navigators rather than the pilots. Pitchfork's book, published by Pen and Sword in the 2000s, drew on his own diaries and on the recollections of his contemporaries. The tone was measured. The aircraft had done what it was designed to do. The crews had done what they had been trained to do. The Americans had observed the result and had drawn their own conclusions. The political and strategic context, the sterling crisis, the IMF loan, the Treasury pressure on the defense budget, the looming tornado decisions was sketched lightly. The Buccaneer community did not, on the whole, see itself as having made history. It saw itself as having flown an exercise. The historians have been more interested. Peter Hennessy's work on the Cold War in Whitehall, drawn from cabinet papers released through the National Archives at Kew, has touched on the period and on the relationship between defence capability and political credibility under Callaghan. Christopher Andrews' Authorised History of the Security Service and the wider literature on British intelligence in the late Cold War has illustrated how technical and operational performance was used in the corridors between Downing Street, the MOD and the JIC to argue for the maintenance of particular capabilities against Treasury cuts. Lawrence Freedman's strategic studies have placed the Buccaneer in the context of NATO's evolving doctrine of conventional deterrence after the SALT process began to constrain the nuclear options. What the red flag deployment showed beyond the tactical detail was that an air force operating an aircraft 15 years past its design date, under a government pressed by a financial crisis, could still demonstrate, against the most modern equipment of its closest ally, a capability that the ally did not match. The reasons were not exotic. They were training, doctrine, and the willingness to accept a level of operational risk in peacetime, 4 aircrew lost between 1972 and 1976, that another air force would not have accepted. The Americans understood this when they wrote up the lessons at Nellis. The British understood it when they wrote up the reports at High Wycombe. Neither side said so publicly at the time. The last RAF Buccaneer flew on March 31, 1994, from RAF Lossiemouth, with squadron leader Nigel Maddox at the controls. The aircraft was XX-894. It performed a single low pass over the airfield at, by some accounts, less than 100 feet. The technique by then was no longer secret. The aircraft was retired into the museums at Cosford, Duxford and Elvington, and into private hands at Bruntingthorpe and Kemble, where one example continued to taxi under its own power into the 2010s. The red flag results sat in the files at Kew, declassified, available and largely unread.